Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Jonas Lukacek and I welcome you to this talk where I am going to present a localized approach to topological simplification called LTS. LTS computes the exact same result as the current state-of-the-art simplification procedure implemented in the topology toolkit, but LTS is an order of magnitude faster as it utilizes shared memory parallelism and constrains computationally expensive procedures onto the subsets of the domain that actually need to be simplified. But before I get into the details of LTS, I want to motivate our work and recap our thought process that led us towards this approach. Over the last decades, scalar field topology has been established as a Swiss Army knife for data analysis. Here you can see an example scalar field defined on a 2D surface where the scalar field corresponds to the height function. Scalar field topology provides various abstractions that can be used to characterize features in such datasets. For example, the critical points of the scalar field, contours for a given ISO value, sub- and super-level set components, the family of graph abstractions such as the merge tree, crown components of the merge tree, and of course the more small complex, here shown for the boundary of the surface. All these abstractions evolve around critical points, which play an essential role in many topology-based algorithms such as LTS. But datasets often exhibit noise, or there exists an importance hierarchy between features that can be used to filter features. Let's say by some arbitrary user-defined metric, the left maximum would be considered noise, so we want to filter any topological abstraction that is associated with it. So of course we can compute the abstractions as before and then post hoc determine which part of the abstractions belong to that discarded maximum and then remove them. So we would have to remove the left contour, super-level set component, merge tree arc, crown component, and we would have to merge more small complex cells. This requires a tailored algorithm for each abstraction, and care has to be taken that they are all consistent with each other. LTS follows another approach where we actually change the input function such that it no longer exhibits undesired extrema. Then any abstraction computed on the simplified field is automatically consistent, and on top of that we can actually do the simplification symbolically, but more about that later. There exist several approaches that follow this concept, and I refer you to the related work section of our paper for a thorough discussion of these approaches. For the sake of simplicity, it suffices to say that LTS is based on the approach of Cheney and Pascucci, who describe generalized topological simplification of scalar fields on surfaces. Their approach is the default simplification mechanism in the topology toolkit, and we compare our results to this state-of-the-art implementation. However, their approach needs to iteratively process the entire scalar field to yield a simplification, and therefore often corresponds to the most time-consuming part of a topological data analysis pipeline. In the following, I will show how we can derive a localized simplification scheme that only processes the parts of the input field that actually needs to be simplified, and how we can even parallelize this process. Alright, so how does LTS work? I will explain this now from the perspective of removing maxima, but the case of removing minima is symmetrical. First, we need to determine the region that is associated with an undesired maximum. We can do this with a so-called super-level set propagation, which starts at an undesired maximum and then always absorbs the largest neighbor of the region until the procedure encounters a vertex that has a larger neighbor that has not been visited by the propagation. Such a vertex must correspond to a saddle, so we have determined the complete super-level set component. Next, we set all values of the region to the saddle value, which creates a scalar plateau. Now we could call it a day, but many topological abstractions require combinatorial robustness. That means a global, non-ambiguous vertex order. This leads us to the gold nugget of LTS, in which we determine a symbolic perturbation for which the plateau does not contain any critical points. This process can be imagined as fixing the plateau at the saddle and then slightly tilting it downwards. Technically, we want to derive a new scalar field on the plateau such that the saddle is the only maximum and every minimum exhibits a neighbor outside the plateau. Imagine if this would be true, then the saddle becomes a regular vertex since it must have a larger neighbor outside the plateau. And also every minimum becomes a regular vertex because every neighbor outside the plateau has to be smaller than the plateau as it was computed based on a super-level set propagation. So extrema of the plateau become regular vertices on the entire domain, which is exactly what we want. The key insight to observe here is that enforcing these criteria is itself a topological simplification problem restricted to the plateau. Solving this local problem in arbitrary dimensions is very technical and you can find the details in the paper, but LTS essentially follows the iterative procedure defined by Tierney and Pascucci to solve this local simplification problem. On my webpage you can also find some additional slides that animate this procedure in detail for a more complex example. Now that we know how LTS works in general, I want to highlight that all these steps can be parallelized with some light synchronization. If we want to remove multiple maxima, then we can just concurrently compute the corresponding components, flatten their regions, and then independently disambiguate the resulting plateaus. In the case where multiple superlevel set propagations reach the same saddle, then we need to continue the propagation until we find a saddle with an unvisited larger neighbor. This is the case which requires some light synchronization at the saddles. Then we can flatten and disambiguate the combined regions at once. LTS can also be specialized for the case of persistence-driven simplification. As explained before, LTS can remove extrema based on any user-defined metric. If this metric corresponds to persistence, then in the previous TTK workflow one had to first compute all persistence pairs and then feed a blacklist of extrema that correspond to non-persistent pairs into the simplification procedure. However, superlevel set propagations used in LTS can actually be used to compute the non-persistent pairs without prior knowledge. So for this, LTS initializes for each maximum a superlevel set propagation as described before, but with the additional constraint that the propagation terminates as soon as it exceeds a given persistence threshold. After all propagations terminate, we know which propagations did not exceed the persistence threshold and therefore need to be simplified. This early escape provides a significant speedup over the previous approach, as we do not have to compute all persistence pairs in the preprocessing step. Now I want to give you a quick tour of some results we obtained with our C++ LTS implementation, which uses OpenMP for parallelization and which is embedded as a module in the topology toolkit. All our experiments were conducted on a machine with 12 cores, with publicly available datasets from different research domains. In the first case study, we characterized vortices in a computational fluid dynamics simulation that models the injection of a jet into a medium at rest. Here we can identify vortices via the ground components of the merge tree, in other words the augmented leaf arcs of the merge tree. The initial vortex characterization shown on the left is broken up into small components due to noise. Usually one would filter extrema by persistence to join vortices into more sensible connected regions, but in this example a single global persistence threshold is not enough to adequately portray the flow behavior. To generate the image on the right, we actually use different persistence thresholds for 3 different parts of the domain. At the bottom, we use a low persistence threshold in order not to discard the vortices, which would be lost for the more aggressive threshold used at the top of the jet. At the base of the jet, we actually suppressed all maxima except one, so now they are all segmented as one component. This highlights that LTS can handle arbitrary extrema selections, and that we can also use LTS for interactive analysis, since on a machine with 12 cores it only takes 7 seconds to simplify the field, whereas the state-of-the-art approach in TTK takes almost 3 minutes. Imagine the impact on your workflow if you need to adjust the persistence threshold. This is where LTS really shines. In the next example, we characterize the boundaries and nuclei of plant cells via contours, superlevel set components, and separatrices of the more small complex. If we use this feature characterization on the unsimplified input image, we end up with a lot of false positives due to noise. In this example, it makes sense to suppress non-persistent maxima saddle pairs, and to determine sensible persistence thresholds, we can examine the persistence curve if it exhibits any plateaus. The endpoints of such plateaus often correspond to thresholds that separate noise from signal, and we can see that the threshold on the right side of the plateau yields some strong segmentation results. This example also highlights the primary advantage of pre-simplifying the data over post-simplifying the abstractions, namely that once the data is simplified, all subsequent computed abstractions benefit from the simplification and are consistent with each other. In the silicium dataset, we used the more small complex to represent the structure of the silicium grid. This example highlights that LTS only affects regions that actually need to be simplified. As shown here, filtering extrema that do not correspond to silicium atoms only affect the feature characterization locally. In the backpack dataset, individual items can be identified via contours, but the persistence curve does not exhibit a clear plateau, so the user has to experiment with different persistence thresholds to produce an adequate segmentation. As mentioned before, the significant speedup of LTS enables such iterative analysis. The bold numbers in this table indicate the speedup of LTS over the baseline approach of Tierney and Pascucci. LTS is across the board significantly faster than the baseline approach. Even the non-parallel version of LTS is faster, as it only processes the parts of the domain that actually need to be simplified. In parallel with 12 cores, LTS is at least 20 times faster and achieves an excellent parallel efficiency. For stress cases where we only want to simplify all but one extremum, performance starts to deteriorate, as LTS now has to process almost the entire domain. But LTS is still up to an order of magnitude faster. In conclusion, we proposed a novel approach to topological simplification that is output sensitive, restricts computationally expensive procedures onto parts of the domain that actually need to be simplified, and that can additionally be parallelized. The resulting speedup of up to an order of magnitude enables interactive analysis, and the presented approach is going to be released through TTK. However, the current LTS implementation is optimized for desktop machines, so it is likely that LTS needs to be adapted to fully leverage the computational power of an HPC environment. As a technical limitation, LTS is only able to remove extrema saddle pairs. So in future work, we need to explore if LTS can be extended to also remove saddle pairs. This concludes my talk, and I thank you all for your attention. Goodbye.